My name is Seth Berry. I'm a state representative from Bowdoin and also the House Chair of the Joint Standing Committee on Energy, Utilities, and Technology. Really appreciate everyone joining us today. And I'm going to be introducing our guests now. Very privileged to have with us three well-known Maine economists. I probably need no introduction, but I'll go ahead anyway with just briefly. Dr. Richard Silkman is a Yale Ph.D. economist and a nationally recognized expert in public utility and energy finance. He procures energy and consults with large industrial and commercial consumers in the purchase of energy under his business Competitive Energy Services. Dr. David Vail is Adams Catlin Professor of Economics Emeritus and former Director of Environmental Studies at Bowdoin College. And Dr. Dick Woodbury is a Program Administrator at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a former state senator. We're incredibly privileged to have them with us today to talk about this legislation, an act to create the Pine Tree Power Company, a new and improved version of the bill that you all heard about 2 years ago. And we're gonna turn to Dr. Silkman to kind of kick it off, speak briefly to the economics of this proposal, and then we'll turn to David Vail and to Dick Woodbury to chime in afterwards. There'll be time for Q&A, and with that, I'll turn it right over to Rich.
Well, thanks, Seth. The central aspect in the difference between consumer-owned utilities and investor-owned utilities is whether or not there are stockholders. And if you think about investor-owned utilities, there are private entity stockholders that provide equity into the company that's used to develop, to make investments, to operate the company, and to grow the company. The financing of investor-owned utilities relies upon money that's invested by the stockholders and money that's borrowed from banks. The principal reason why you have stockholders in a company is to bear risk. I mean, they're the entities that put in capital that is at risk or at most at risk in developing an enterprise. And as a result, typically across the economy, there's a premium that's paid for equity in the form of a higher rate of return than, for example, on debt or on other kinds of capital investments into a utility. The result of that is that you have a financial structure for a commercial or investor-owned utility that's roughly 50% debt, 50% equity. The debt usually is borrowed today in today's market at somewhere between 4 and 5%. It's long-term debt, building things like transmission lines, distribution lines, substations, those kinds of things. The 50% that's equity is provided a return that is thought of as being a risk-adjusted return in the sense that you compensate shareholders for bearing risk, and the returns on a pre-tax basis are usually in the 10 to 13% range, sometimes a little higher, sometimes on the low end, depending upon the regulatory structure and the utility at question. But when you combine the two, 50-50 weighting and those two returns, you get a cost of capital that is roughly 8 to 10%. And that's what it costs ratepayers to attract the capital necessary to operate the utility. In a consumer-owned utility or a municipal utility, there are no shareholders. There are banks that you borrow from, and there are ratepayers who are on the hook, so to speak, to pay for any debt service costs incurred by the consumer-owned utility. the cost for borrowing, depending upon whether the entity can do it on a tax exempt basis or not, can run between the high 2% to the low 4%. But that's for 100% of the capital invested in the utility. So if you look at the capital structures, you have the investor-owned utility, 50-50 debt and equity. In a sense, it's like if you buy a house, you can get 50% investment, but you got to put 50% down. I mean, that's the rough relationship. In a consumer-owned utility, it's 100% debt, and it's at a lower rate. Now, the reason why you're able to do 100% debt, I mean, banks don't like 100% debt, right? They want to have somebody bearing risk. They don't want to be the only entity exposed. And so the trade-off is that the ratepayers bear the risk. If there's a cost overrun, if there's a mismanagement issue, if something goes wrong, the ratepayers in the form of higher rates that will then be charged bear the risk. So if you look at the two models, you have an investor-owned utility with a higher cost of capital, but you have shareholders bearing risk, theoretically. On the consumer-owned utility, you have a lower cost of capital and therefore lower rates, but the ratepayers bear risk. So the question really boils down to, are ratepayers getting a good deal when we opt for an investor-owned utility? Now, if there's a lot of risk associated with running the operation, then maybe investors are getting a good deal. Right? It's always nicer to push risk over to somebody else. Like if a storm hits and all the wires and poles get knocked down and the shareholders have to pay for that, they bear the risk of weather, then that's a good deal. Right? We'll pay them a little bit more for their equity if they bear that risk. But we know they don't bear that risk, right? What ends up happening if there's a storm that hits and all the poles and wires get knocked down, what happens is the ratepayers have to pay for that replacement. They have to pay for that. So they don't bear risk associated with that. Well, what about if they're building a project, a substation, for instance, up in Mount Desert Island, and the costs double for whatever reason? Well, if the shareholders have to pay that incremental cost, then maybe again, it's a good deal to have shareholders because we're paying lower rates because we don't have to bear risk. Well, that's not a bad deal. But the problem is that when costs overrun, who gets stuck with them? Ratepayers. Right? We never get into situations where the shareholders bear that risk. It's just pass through cost to ratepayers. Well, what about mismanagement? And what if something goes wrong? People don't show up for work or they're not very productive. Well, what happens in those contexts is that we'd like the shareholders to have a much lower return on equity, but that's not how it works, right? What ends up happening is those costs get passed on to ratepayers in the form of rate increases. And so when you look at the deal we signed up for as ratepayers, the deal is one-sided, right? What has happened is the regulatory paradigm historically for investor-owned utilities is we'll pay higher rates, right? Because they have a higher cost of capital because the ratepayers are bearing the risk. The problem, though, is that ratepayers don't bear risk. I'm sorry, shareholders are bearing the risk. The problem is that the shareholders don't bear the risk. The regulatory paradigm doesn't work that way. Ratepayers bear the risk. If you think about the history of CMP or the history of now Versant, but Bangor Hydro and Emera before them, there are lots of examples of cost overruns. There are lots of examples of problems that have arisen with management. Most recently, for instance, we have the case with the billing system at CMP. Ratepayers had no say in that billing system. Management made the decisions, management implemented it, management operated it. They spent $60 million for a new billing system and the billing system didn't work. What happened? Well, if you were in the private sector, what would happen is shareholders would have borne the burden. They would have said to their customers, we'd like to charge you for this billing system. Customers would have said, we're not paying for it, it's not working. So shareholders would have been on the hook. In the regulatory system we have in Maine, what happened is CMP said, it's not working, it cost us $60 million. Shareholders pay us the $60 million and we'll get around to fixing it. Right? Well, the PUC looked at it and said, maybe not, maybe that was a mismanagement problem. So what we're going to do is we're going to penalize the shareholders. But did they penalize them the $60 million? No, they knocked them down, 100 basis points on their return on equity. So instead of getting a return on equity of 9.5%, they get 8.5%. Not a very significant penalty. So ultimately, the whole point of moving from an investor-owned utility, from a financial perspective, from an investor-owned utility to a consumer-owned utility is to recognize what is currently going on, that shareholders are ratepayers are bearing risk. And because we're bearing risk, we don't want to pay shareholders anymore to do that. And when we move to a consumer-owned utility, the costs of our capital, the costs to build the system go way down. When they go down, rates go down. And most importantly, looking forward, as we electrify society, as we get more EVs, as we get more heat pumps, as we convert some of our manufacturing process to electricity, to get us away from fossil fuels, we're going to have much more electricity consumption.
Thank you, Senator Claxton, Representative Meyer.
And as we have much more electricity consumption, what's going to happen is the electric grid is going to have to get bigger, which requires more investment. And so one of the great virtues of moving to the consumer-owned utility is as we build out that grid, and it's going to cost a lot of money, $5–10 billion range, depending upon how much we electrify. As we build out that grid, it's way better to do it with 3% money than it is to do it with 8.5%, 10% money. It will be a much, much cheaper proposition for ratepayers all around. So that's the economic side of this. I'm sure David and Dick will have other things to say about other aspects of it, including management control and so on. So with that said, I'll stop and turn it over to my brethren.
Great, thank you, Rich. And before we turn to the other practitioners of the dismal science, I neglected to say that I mentioned your Yale PhD. I didn't mention that David is also a Yale PhD economist, and we put the Harvard guy last. So
where he belongs.
Right. I'll leave you guys to comment on that. Dr. Vail, what say you?
Yeah, call me David.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Seth. I'd like to make just a couple of brief points. One is to add a benefit that Pine Tree Power would bring that goes beyond the ones that Dr. Silkman was presented so effectively. And the other is to express an opinion that is obviously subjective about the superiority of a consumer-owned utility in the specific context that the Maine Climate Council has presented to us, which is to move to a fossil fuel-free electrical grid by 2035. And of course, that is echoed by the Biden administration's policy as well. Rapid decarbonization of electrical power, which Rich touched on. It seems to me that it's great news that Maine is finally gearing up to establish universal high-speed internet in rural areas. A lot of my work has been with rural tourism destinations over the last 10 or 20 years, and they are unanimous that having high-speed internet connectivity is critical for their future development. And I think what we know is that last mile connectivity Whatever we do with middle mile facilities in Maine is going to depend largely on the pole infrastructure from the electrical grid. And one of the things that strikes me as important about the Pine Tree Power legislation is that it is mandated to provide that kind of access and to do it in an efficient way. So that's one point I think that goes beyond what will happen to costs of electricity. The opinion is, well, I would say we're all familiar, I think, with a couple stories about performance of the current investor-owned, I would add, foreign-owned utilities. One is the very poor reliability rating that Dr. Silkman referred to, outages that, in my opinion, stem in large part from a reluctance to make adequate investments in grid resilience measures. And of course, we could talk in detail about what some of those might be. The second example is the recent Central Maine power foot dragging and exorbitant cost estimates for connectivity of new solar installations, commercial solar capacity to the grid. So just to say, in technical terms, economists might describe this as a situation of misaligned incentives between the investor-owned utility and what we need for the grid of the future. But I would say that these two examples and others that we could come up with as well are powerful evidence that the current investor ownership is not the optimal in organizational structure or ownership structure to get to the grid that we're going to need for deep decarbonization and the kind of beneficial electrification that Dr. Silkman was talking about. So that'll do it for me, Seth.
Thank you, David. That was great. And last but not least, Dick Woodbury, who I was privileged to serve with for a time on the taxation committee, taught me a whole lot when he was a state senator. And Dick, can you wrap us up?
I'll do my best. I certainly agree with what's been said, but I'll take just a slightly different tack on it. If we want to do this thing, as in seriously transform what our energy landscape looks like, and it's a really profound change. And you know, Rich could tell you more specifically what it looks like, but it's something in the ballpark of 4 times the amount of electricity we're going to be using. You know, we're going to double once for the fact we're going to have electric vehicles and other electric transportation. We're going to double again by the fact we're going to have electric heating and electric industrial uses. So it's enormously larger than what we're using right now in order to do this in a clean environment way. Getting from here to there is an investment, and it's an investment in generation sources that are different, but it's also an investment in a transmission grid that is different. And it's different in part because the sources of where the power comes from are different, but it's also different in that it's going to have a different character, and that it's going to have a bit of a decentralized aspect to it, in which, you know, it's going to have community solar farms. It's going to have home solar and battery systems. It's going to be a really different grid than the grid we have right now. And there's an investment to get from here to there that we can pay for. And, you know, this is where Rich's study and his points today were so important. We can get there by a super low interest rate that the consumer-owned utility is going to be able to obtain. Or we can get it, you know, or we can, you know, try to get there. It's not nowhere nearly as feasible if we try to do it with the rates that are possible in the investor-owned marketplace. So that's the broad bottom line from my point of view in why this thing is so important. But I'm going to make 2 other points that are not at all irrelevant to that conversation. And that is that the current owners of the current grid profit more from using the grid the way it is right now, not from transforming it into what it needs to be for the future. And you see that a bit in their resistance to things like net metering and things like that. But the bottom line is that if we want to change it, we want to be able to encourage the transformation of the grid that is the grid of the future. And that really contrasts with what an investor-owned utility, which wants to use the grid that it has and make profits on the grid that it has. So, not only is there sort of this difference in the cost of the transformation, but even in terms of whether you want to be a supporter of the transformation or whether you want to impede it, is a distinct difference between the consumer-owned version of this and the investor-owned version. And, last, I'll just, I mean, both Rich and David referred to this. I don't know how the current investor-owned utility is operating, and who's bearing the risk, and those sorts of questions. And I have to say that we're in a realm right now where electricity and electricity transmission is very much a central public interest. We talk about a public utility, and I think it's fair to ask, is our current public utility, the investor-owned version sort of that we have right now, is it acting in the public interest in the things that it does? I would argue that it's really not, and that's not exactly a blaming a multinational corporation. Its responsibility is to its shareholders, not to the public interest. Its whole point of being is to maximize the profits for its shareholders. So it's not a blame per se, but it's the wrong structure for what today is such a critical public aspect of our public interest infrastructure. I guess I'll stop there. And
Great. Well, thank you, Dick. That was powerful. And this is a moment, we have a limited amount of time for questions. I'm going to prioritize legislators since you're the ones who will have the quiz sooner and have to vote on this sooner. The bill does propose, by the way, that it be sent to the voters in November. So we all will have a say, just as we all have a say in electing board members and governing the thing if it gets created. But questions from legislators about the economics that we just heard about from these three economists? All right, let me open it up to others in that case. And please raise your hand, anyone that does have a question. And we'll try to do, make this kind of a lightning round in the 4 minutes that we have. I'm going to recognize while we're waiting, we have at least one other economist with us, Jono Anzalone. Did I say your name right? I'm not sure. And Jono is the CEO director of the Kennebunkport Climate Initiative. Is that the right name? Which is it's an amazing. This is not just Kennebunkport. This thing is national. It is a huge initiative to do with education and climate. I strongly encourage you to look it up and check it out. Jono, thanks for joining us today. Well, I don't see any questions. Oh, there we go. Robin Ladkin.
Robin Ladkin has a question. Yeah.
Well, I just want to extend the conversation very briefly in a way that Barry will understand from our conversation yesterday towards generation as well as distribution. Mm-hmm. Sure. I just wonder if any of you could comment particularly in relation to offshore wind, which requires such large levels of investment and infrastructure and so on, in pursuit of Maine actually being independent in terms of its energy in the future.
That's a great question. I'm going to direct that to Rich Silkman. And Rich, is this
Yeah.
connected literally or figuratively to that offshore wind question?
Well, I mean, we have separated in Maine generation from delivery, so it's not necessarily connected, but the same principles apply. Nicole, Representative Grahowski, who's on the call, I believe, introduced legislation to establish the Maine Generation Authority. That bill was heard earlier this week. And the purpose of that authority is to procure on behalf of ratepayers enough renewable generation to meet Maine's needs. What we know is that we cannot become carbon neutral. We cannot get away from fossil fuels without offshore wind. And the reason is because we need to meet, as Dick Woodbury mentioned, our heating requirements with electricity. And one of the things that's distinct about our heating requirements is that they are in the winter, they are at night, they're on rainy, raw days, all of which have very poor sunshine. So solar doesn't work very well. But what really does work well during that time is onshore and offshore wind. Problem with onshore is there just aren't enough sites available to get us all the electricity we need. And the offshore wind has really good potential. But make no mistake about it, I mean, the Gulf of Maine is going to be developed. It's going to be developed by either Massachusetts, New Hampshire, or Maine. It also may be developed by New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, right? The question here isn't whether we're going to have turbines out there. We are. The question is whether or not Maine gets to actually benefit from those turbines, or whether all that power just flows into Portsmouth or into Salem or into Boston.
And maybe we'll do a follow-up on that exact question. But Rich has pointed out that trust is a big thing. You know, the development of transmission lines will be critical to meet our clean energy needs. And you know, his work is really seminal on the economics of this. Encourage you to read his book. Maybe someone has it. Oh, look, I have it right here. Strongly encourage you to check this out. It is online as well. But this is the first kind of roadmap that we've seen to get us to 2050 to full decarbonization, not the climate council goal of 80% lower than our 1990 levels by 2050, but fully decarbonized. It's really a seminal work. And we're lucky to have all three of these economists here today. Just briefly, I want to mention that we do have some constitutional jurisprudence which limits what we can do from a regulatory perspective. These business models are fundamentally different from that perspective as well. We cannot simply regulate our way out of this, because the Hope and the Bluefield decisions of the US Supreme Court constrain regulators and constrain state legislatures and constrain even Congress the same way that Citizens United constrains us around clean elections. To take advantage of this low-cost capital, we need to change the business model. We can't simply regulate the investor-owned utilities into behaving like consumer-owned utilities. It just doesn't work. It's not allowed in the U.S. Legal structure, constitutional structure. I just have to flash in front of you on the way out one chart from Dr. Silkman, which you may have seen before, and I hope you're seeing now. It is the one on the right. On the left, you see that on average, consumer-owned utilities like the Pine Tree Power Company cost 13% less, have 13% lower rates. But in Maine, what that would mean if we were to make this transition is that the net savings, the net benefits to ratepayers would be $9 billion over the first 30 years. This is Dr. Silkman's work as well. It is savings from year one. There are no tax dollars involved in this transition. And that's a pretty powerful chart that I just wanted to make sure you saw on our way out